faster than the factories could replace them. Worse, they were losing pilots faster than training schools could produce them. James had received 6 months of flight training before being thrust into combat. The newest arrivals got 4 months. Some got less. They arrived at the squadron with perhaps 30 hours of flight time in a Spitfire, and most of them died within a week. Thomas Richardson had lasted 3 days. The Spitfire's tail lifted as James pushed the throttle forward, and then the earth fell away beneath him with that peculiar sensation that never quite became routine, that moment when man and machine defied the natural order and climbed into the sky. The engine roared, the propeller clawed at the air, and James Edward Thornton, who 3 months ago had been a junior clerk at a law firm in Canterbury, became once again a weapon pointed at the heart of Nazi Germany. The formation assembled over Biggin Hill, 12 Spitfires climbing in tight formation toward the southeast. Red section, blue section, yellow section. Each section consisted of 4 aircraft, though they had launched with only 3 in yellow section because there simply were no more serviceable aircraft or pilots to fill the gap. Command had scraped together this squadron from the remnants of 3 other units that had been mauled over Kent and Sussex during the previous weeks. All sections, this is Red Leader, Angels 2-0. We're to patrol between Maidstone and the coast. Eyes sharp, gentlemen. Jerry likes to come out of the sun. 20,000 feet. James checked his oxygen flow and settled into position as Red 2, flying off Squadron Leader Dalton's right wing. To his right flew Red 3, a Canadian named Robert Mackenzie, who spoke little but flew with an aggressive precision that bordered on reckless. Red 4 was a replacement pilot who had arrived yesterday. James did not know his name. He tried not to learn the names anymore. The English countryside spread out below them, green and peaceful in the September afternoon. From this height, there was no evidence of war. The bombing raids, the shattered cities, the columns of refugees clogging the roads, all of it disappeared into a pastoral landscape that looked unchanged since medieval times. It was almost possible to believe up here in the thin air that the world below was still sane. Bandits, bandits. 12 o'clock level, about 2 miles, count 30 plus. Blue Leader's voice shattered the momentary illusion. James squinted against the sun and saw them, a dark swarm emerging from the haze over the coast. Bombers in tight formation, their white contrails marking the sky like chalk lines on a blackboard. And above them, weaving back and forth like shepherds guarding their flock, the fighter escort. Messerschmitt, BF-19s, perhaps 50 of them. Christ, someone muttered over the radio. There's hundreds of the bastards. Radio discipline, Squadron Leader Dalton snapped. All sections, we're going after the bombers. Ignore the fighters unless they engage. Diving attack from the sun. Stay in formation until I break. Tally-ho! The Spitfire's nose dropped, and suddenly they were diving, falling out of the sky at 300 miles per hour, the wind screaming past the canopy, the entire aircraft shaking with barely controlled violence. James's stomach lurched into his throat. His vision narrowed. The bomber formation grew larger with terrifying speed. Individual aircraft resolving from the mass, Heinkel He-111s with their distinctive glass noses and black crosses stark against camouflage paint. This was the moment James hated most, the diving attack where everything happened too fast for thought, where instinct and training took over and the conscious mind became merely a passenger in its own body. The gun sight centered on a bomber. His thumb found the gun button. And in the 2 seconds before Squadron Leader Dalton fired the first burst, James Edward Thornton had time to think about the men in that aircraft. German boys, probably not much older than himself. Boys who had mothers and sisters and perhaps sweethearts waiting in Hamburg or Munich or Berlin. Then the 8 machine guns in Red Leader's wings began to chatter, and the time for thinking about anything except survival ended. The bomber shuddered as rounds walked across its wing. Pieces of metal tore away and spun into the slipstream. James pressed his own gun button and felt the Spitfire shake as 4 machine guns and 2 20-mm cannons opened fire. The tracer rounds arced across the sky like deadly fireflies. Something exploded inside the bomber's fuselage. Smoke began pouring from an engine. "Brake! Brake right!" James hauled on the stick, pulling nearly 6 Gs as he wrenched the Spitfire into a hard turn. A Messerschmitt flashed through the space where he had been a second earlier, its own guns blazing. The German had come out of nowhere, dropping from above like a hawk on a sparrow. This was what killed new pilots. They fixated on their target and forgot to check their tail. They forgot that for every hunter, there was always another hunter. The Spitfire groaned under the strain of the turn. James's vision grayed at the edges as the blood drained from his head. He eased off slightly, just enough to keep from blacking out, and rolled level. The sky around him had dissolved into chaos. Aircraft everywhere, twisting and turning, climbing and diving. Smoke trails marked the death spirals of machines whose pilots had made a mistake or simply run out of luck. A parachute blossomed white against the blue sky. Friend or enemy? Impossible to tell. James looked for squadron leader Dalton and saw nothing. Red section had scattered. The careful formations had dissolved in the violence of combat, and now it was every man for himself, a swirling melee, where the only rules were shoot first and never fly straight for more than 2 seconds. A Messerschmitt crossed his nose, perhaps 200 yards away. James pulled lead, tracked the target, and fired a short burst. Missed. The German pilot was good, jinking and weaving, making himself difficult to hit. James stayed with him, closing the distance, waiting for a clear shot. The German pulled up sharply, trying to climb away using the Messerschmitt's superior rate of climb. But James anticipated the move and pulled up with him, keeping the German in his gun sight. At 100 yards, he fired again. This time the rounds found their mark. The Messerschmitt's canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away toward the earth far below. James did not watch it fall. He was already looking for the next threat, head on a swivel, eyes scanning every quadrant of sky. "Red 2, you've got one on your tail. Break left," Mackenzie's voice, urgent and sharp. James threw the Spitfire into a savage turn without hesitation, without even taking time to look behind him. Trust your wingman. That was the first rule of fighter combat. When your wingman said break, you broke, and you asked questions later. Cannon shells cracked past his canopy, close enough that he could see them streaking by, close enough to smell the cordite. The German had almost had him. James completed the turn and saw Mackenzie diving past, his guns hammering away at the Messerschmitt that had been on James's tail. The German fighter rolled and dove away, smoke pouring from its engine. "Thanks, Mac," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "Watch your bloody 6, Mackenzie replied. "I won't always be there." The engagement had lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. James's flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands ached from gripping the stick. His neck hurt from constantly twisting his head to check behind him, and they were not done. The bombers were continuing toward London, and more Spitfires and Hurricanes were climbing to intercept them. The battle was just beginning. "All Red Section aircraft, this is Red Leader. Reform on me, heading 270. We're going after the stragglers." So Squadron Leader Dalton had survived. That was something. James spotted the distinctive markings on Dalton's aircraft and turned to rejoin, checking his fuel and ammunition as he did so. Ammunition low, fuel below half, but enough for another engagement, enough to make a difference. 3 bombers had fallen behind the main formation, damaged by the initial attack and struggling to maintain altitude. They were easy targets, but they were not defenseless. The Heinkel He-111 carried 5 machine guns, and the gunners were not shy about using them. Dalton led the attack from behind and slightly below, coming up under the bomber's tail where the defensive fire was weakest. James selected the rightmost bomber and closed to within 200 yards before opening fire. His remaining ammunition poured into the aircraft's belly. The bomber staggered. Its left engine burst into flames. The pilot tried to maintain control, but the fire spread rapidly, consuming the wing. The bomber rolled onto its back and fell, spinning lazily as it descended toward the English countryside below. Men were dying in that aircraft. 4 or 5 German aircrew, burning or already dead or trapped inside a metal coffin, falling at terminal velocity toward the earth. James felt nothing. He had learned not to feel anything. Sympathy was a luxury that had no place in a fighter cockpit. The men in that bomber had been trying to kill him. They had been flying to London to drop bombs on civilians, on children, On people who had no defense except the handful of exhausted pilots who rose each day to stop them. "Red 2, watch your ammunition." The radio call cut off in mid-sentence. James looked for squadron leader Dalton and saw his Spitfire falling, trailing smoke and flames. A Messerschmitt pulled up and away from the kill, waggling its wings in triumph. Dalton's aircraft fell for another few seconds, and then it exploded, a brief orange fireball that dissipated almost immediately, leaving nothing but smoke and falling debris. No parachute. Squadron leader Thomas Dalton had led the squadron for 6 weeks, an eternity in the Battle of Britain. He had flown in the First World War as an observer in 2-seater reconnaissance aircraft. He had survived 20 years between wars. He had returned to service when Britain needed him most. And now he was gone, snuffed out in a moment. His skill and experience and accumulated wisdom scattered across the sky like the burning fragments of his aircraft. "This is Red 2. Red leader is down. All Red section, break and make for home. I repeat, break and return to base." James had no authority to give orders. He was not the senior pilot, but someone had to make a decision, and the other pilots obeyed without question. They scattered, diving for the deck, pushing their throttles to maximum, running for home with the desperation of animals fleeing a predator. The flight back to Biggin Hill took 20 minutes, though it felt longer. James flew low, hugging the ground, pushing his damaged aircraft as hard as he dared. The engine was running rough, temperature gauge edging into the red. The aircraft had taken hits somewhere, though he had not felt the impact. Bullets could pass through aluminum skin without the pilot even noticing, and only later would you discover that something critical had been damaged. The Spitfire held together. The engine kept running, and RAF Biggin Hill appeared ahead, the grass runway marked with white crosses, ground crew waiting. James lowered his landing gear and felt the satisfying thunk as the wheels locked into place. Flaps down, throttle back. The Spitfire settled onto the grass with a gentle bump, and James let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He had survived another sortie. Ground crew swarmed over the aircraft before the propeller had even stopped turning. They found 12 bullet holes in the fuselage and wings. One round had passed within 6 inches of the cockpit, close enough that James could see the hole it had punched through the aluminum. 6 inches. The difference between life and death. "Good show, sir," the crew chief said, his face expressionless. "We'll have her patched up in an hour." An hour. That was how long James had before he would be expected to climb back into this aircraft and do it all again. An hour to eat something, to drink tea that tasted like motor oil, to sit in the dispersal hut and pretend to read a newspaper while his hands shook and his mind replayed the engagement over and over, looking for mistakes, looking for lessons, looking for anything that might keep him alive a little longer. The dispersal hut smelled of sweat and cigarette smoke and fear, though no one would admit to the fear. 8 pilots sat in various states of exhaustion, some sleeping in chairs, some playing cards with mechanical disinterest, some simply staring at nothing. 2 pilots were missing, squadron leader Dalton, dead, and Red 4, the replacement whose name James had never learned. No one knew if he had been shot down or simply became separated and landed at another airfield. "Heard they got Tommy," said a pilot named Stevens. He was lying on a cot, one arm thrown across his eyes. "Bloody shame. He was a good one." "They're all good ones," someone else replied. "That's why Jerry keeps shooting them down." Mackenzie sat in the corner, methodically cleaning his flying goggles. He looked up when James entered, nodded once, and returned to his task. The Canadian was perhaps 22 years old, though combat had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. His eyes were older than his face, older than his hands, old in a way that suggested he had seen too much and expected to see more. "You did well up there," Mackenzie said quietly. "That last bomber. Clean kill." "Dalton's dead because I wasn't watching his 6, James replied. "Dalton's dead because a German put bullets in his aircraft. Nothing you could have done. Nothing anyone could have done." But James was not sure he believed that. The Battle of Britain was fought in 3 dimensions across hundreds of miles of sky, and in such chaos, there were always things that could have been done differently, better, faster. The mathematics of combat were unforgiving. You survived, or you died, and sometimes the difference between those outcomes was nothing more than a random variable. A moment of inattention, a flicker of sunlight on a canopy that caught your eye or did not. The telephone rang. Every head in the dispersal hut turned toward it. The telephone meant only one thing. It meant they were scrambling again. It meant climbing back into the cockpit, back into the sky, back into the chaos where death waited behind every cloud. Red section, scramble! Angels 1-5, multiple bandits inbound from the southeast. The pilots moved without hesitation, running for their aircraft with the peculiar shuffling gait of men wearing heavy flight gear. James pulled on his helmet as he ran, his fingers fumbling with the straps. The ground crew had his Spitfire ready, the engine already warming up. He climbed in, strapped himself down, and was rolling before his instruments had even stabilized. This was the second sortie of the day. There would probably be a third, perhaps a fourth. The Germans were coming in waves, trying to overwhelm fighter command by sheer weight of numbers. The strategy was working. Every day, fewer British fighters rose to meet them. Every day, the defense grew thinner. But not today. Not yet. Not while there were still men willing to climb into these machines and fly into the face of everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. The Spitfire climbed through scattered clouds, heading southeast toward the coast. James checked his oxygen, his fuel, his ammunition. The ground crew had rearmed the aircraft, but he was acutely aware that machine gun ammunition went quickly in combat. 20 seconds of firing, perhaps less, and then the guns fell silent. After that, you became nothing more than a spectator, useful only as a decoy to draw enemy fire away from aircraft that still had ammunition. Red 2, this is Control. We're vectoring you to intercept a formation of V-110s approaching Dover, Angels. 1-8, heading 300. Messerschmitt, Bf 110s. The twin-engine, heavy fighters that the Germans used as bomber escorts and fighter bombers. They were less maneuverable than the Bf-109, but they were heavily armed and could take significant damage. Attacking them from behind was suicide. Their rear gunners could shred a Spitfire before you got close enough for a good shot. The trick was to attack from the side or head-on, using speed and surprise to get inside their defensive envelope before they could bring their guns to bear. James spotted the formation at 15,000 feet, a dozen Me-110s in loose formation. They had not seen him yet. He was above them, coming out of the sun, every advantage in his favor. This was the moment every fighter pilot dreamed of, the perfect setup, the easy kill. Except there were no easy kills. Not really. The moment you believed combat was easy was the moment you made a fatal mistake. James rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep diving attack, building speed rapidly. The Me-110s grew larger in his windscreen. He selected the trailing aircraft and centered it in his gun sight. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The 8 machine guns hammered, and the tracer rounds converged on the target. The Me-110's right engine exploded in a gout of flame. The aircraft rolled to the right and fell away. But the formation had seen him now. The Me-110s scattered, breaking formation, and suddenly James was flying through a storm of defensive fire. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky around him. Something hit his aircraft with a sound like a hammer striking sheet metal. The Spitfire shuddered. The control column went mushy in his hand. Damage. How bad? No time to assess. James hauled the aircraft around in a climbing turn, trying to gain altitude, trying to get above the enemy formation where he could assess the situation. The engine was still running. The controls still responded, though sluggishly, but something was definitely wrong. Red 2, you're streaming coolant. Break off. Return to base. Who had called that? James looked around and saw Mackenzie flying formation on his wing, pointing urgently at James's aircraft. Coolant. The glycol coolant system had been hit. Without coolant, the Merlin engine would overheat in minutes. Already the temperature gauge was climbing into the danger zone. James turned for home, nursing the throttle, trying to keep the engine temperature under control. The math was simple and brutal. He was 40 miles from Biggin Hill. At his current speed, that was about 8 minutes of flying time. Could the engine last 8 minutes? Maybe. Maybe not. The temperature gauge continued to climb. The engine began to run rough. missing beats, coughing. James leaned the mixture, trying to reduce the heat, but it was not enough. At 5 miles from the airfield, the engine seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. The propeller froze. Suddenly, the Spitfire was not a fighter aircraft, but a glider, and not a particularly good one. "Mayday, mayday, this is Red 2. Engine failure. Making forced landing." James scanned the ground below, looking for a suitable field. There, a pasture, relatively flat, no obvious obstacles. He had perhaps 30 seconds to make this work. He lowered the landing gear, but only the right wheel extended. The left gear was jammed, probably damaged by the same burst that had hit the coolant system. Landing with one wheel down was a recipe for disaster. The aircraft would cartwheel the moment the gear touched down. James made the decision instantly. He raised the right gear and locked both wheels in the up position. He would belly land. It was dangerous, but less dangerous than trying to land with asymmetric gear. The pasture came up fast, too fast. James pulled back on the stick, bleeding off speed, trying to flare at just the right moment. The Spitfire's belly touched the grass, and the aircraft slid, tearing through dirt and vegetation, the metal screaming in protest. James was thrown forward against his straps. His head hit the gun sight. Stars exploded in his vision. Then the Spitfire stopped, and everything was suddenly quiet except for the ticking of hot metal cooling and the sound of his own ragged breathing. James sat in the cockpit for a moment, too stunned to move. He was alive. Against all odds, against all probability, he was alive. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely unbuckle his straps. He climbed out of the cockpit on wobbly legs and collapsed onto the grass beside his wrecked aircraft. The Spitfire was finished. The fuselage was torn open from nose to tail. Both wings were damaged beyond repair. The propeller was bent. But James Edward Thornton was alive, and that was all that mattered. A truck arrived from the airfield 15 minutes later, carrying ground crew and an officer from intelligence section who wanted to debrief him immediately. James told them what he could remember, which was not much. Combat was like that. Events that lasted seconds blurred together in memory, becoming jumbled and confused. He remembered firing at the ME-110. He remembered the hit. He remembered the forced landing. Everything else was fragments. They drove him back to Biggin Hill in the truck. Other aircraft were landing as they arrived, returning from the engagement. James counted them as they touched down. 9 Spitfires had taken off. 7 returned. Not a bad ratio, considering. Some days, half the squadron did not come back. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more historical aviation content.